The roar of the engines wasn't the loudest sound on this flight. It was the whisper that turned into ridicule, and the ridicule that snowballed into something far greater than anyone expected. A boy targeted unfairly would stand before the cabin, not as a victim but as someone who carried a revelation powerful enough to turn judgment into silence. For more stories told this way, like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment about where you're joining us from. Jamal Brooks knew before he even boarded that this flight would test his patience. Being young, black, and visibly anxious often meant people saw him not as a kid trying to manage his nerves, but as a problem waiting to happen. His grandmother always reminded him, "Keep your head up, Jamal. Never let them break you." But sitting there, gripping his phone with damp hands, he could already feel the walls closing in. He had whispered to her moments earlier, trying to reassure her that everything was fine, his voice trembling despite his best effort. The plane had not even left the ground when Amanda Collins, the attendant with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, turned his private words into a public spectacle. She leaned close enough for half the cabin to hear and jeered, "He sounds like he's reciting some secret code," her voice slicing through the air like a blade. Jamal froze, his ears burning, as passengers shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward him with suspicion he had not earned. Amanda wasn't done. She reached up, grabbed an oxygen mask, and yanked it down, letting it swing in front of Jamal's face. "Do you even know how to use this?" she sneered, holding it as if presenting evidence of his inadequacy. "Or are you just scared of being caught?" The mockery stung worse than the fear of flying ever had. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the rows, not out of humor but out of the cowardice of people too nervous to confront cruelty. Jamal's chest tightened, his fingers curling around his phone so hard his knuckles turned white. He wanted to disappear, to vanish into the seat cushion, but the humiliation clung to him like chains. Amanda strutted back a few steps, her smirk confident, as though she had scored some silent victory. Jamal sat still, refusing to let tears fall, his mind racing with thoughts of why this always seemed to happen. Why did his nervousness, his voice, his skin become reasons for people to treat him as less? This was supposed to be a proud trip. He had prepared for weeks, rehearsed his lines, planned his wardrobe. Ahead of him was a stage, a microphone, and the honor of speaking at a national youth conference about fairness and justice. He should have been filled with anticipation, not shame. Yet here he was, pinned beneath Amanda's gaze, his confidence stripped away before the plane even taxied to the runway. He thought of his grandmother again, of her gentle voice telling him to stay calm, and forced himself to inhale deeply. The businessman across the aisle leaned back, watching him like one might watch a stray dog, cautious and wary, as though Amanda's words had planted doubt in his mind. Jamal bit the inside of his cheek, holding his tongue. If he spoke, his voice might betray him again, shaky and uncertain, and Amanda would seize on it like a predator catching the scent of weakness. The cabin buzzed with whispers. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked, "Is he dangerous?" The words pierced Jamal's heart, not because they came from malice, but because they echoed the poisonous seeds Amanda had sown so carelessly. Amanda dropped the mask back into place and brushed off her hands as though completing a chore. Her shoes clicked against the aisle floor as she walked away, her posture exuding smug authority. She had marked her target, and everyone knew it. Jamal closed his eyes and clenched his fists. Jamal remained frozen in his seat after Amanda walked away, the sting of her insult still heavy in the air, but he quickly realized she had no intention of letting the matter go. She returned only minutes later with a tray in her hands, her eyes narrowing at him as though he was a disruption rather than a passenger. She stood tall in the aisle, pausing just long enough to gather attention from those around before leaning toward him again and saying in a loud, exaggerated tone, "What is your name, young man?" Jamal blinked, unsure why she was asking something she already had on record, and answered softly, "Jamal Brooks." Amanda cupped her hand to her ear and frowned dramatically, her voice rising so the entire row could hear. "What was that? Say it louder. I can't understand your accent." Heat flooded Jamal's cheeks, but he complied, repeating his name with a little more force. Amanda tilted her head, shaking it as though still unconvinced. "Once more, please, for clarity. Jamal what?" Each word dripped with mockery, and passengers began to shift in their seats, watching with uneasy interest as Jamal repeated himself a third time, his voice cracking slightly. A couple in the next row exchanged glances. whispering as if his very identity had suddenly become suspicious. Amanda smirked, satisfied with the humiliation she had manufactured, and finally stepped back, pulling a small scanner from her pocket. She held out her hand expectantly and snapped, "Boarding pass." Jamal hesitated for a moment, his fingers trembling as he pulled it from his pocket and handed it to her. Instead of scanning it professionally, Amanda snatched it roughly, holding it up high under the cabin light as though examining it for forgery. She turned it over dramatically, letting the passengers in adjacent rows crane their necks. She muttered with a tone of exaggerated suspicion. "I suppose this could be legitimate." Then, with a flick of her wrist, she tossed it back onto Jamal's lap, not even bothering to place it in his hand. The flimsy paper slipped down onto the floor, fluttering at his feet. Jamal bent to retrieve it quickly, his hands shaking, painfully aware of every pair of eyes fixed on him. An older man across the aisle leaned toward his wife and whispered something, and though Jamal could not hear the words, he saw the way the woman nodded with tight lips, her gaze cutting toward him as though he had been caught doing something wrong. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was unfair, that Amanda was deliberately casting shadows over his name, his face, his place on this plane, but Jamal bit down hard on his tongue. His grandmother's warning rang in his mind. Do not give them a reason to twist your anger into proof of guilt. Amanda turned to leave, but paused long enough to glance back at him and smirk, her eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. Jamal felt his stomach twist, not from fear of flying, but from the sickening realization that this flight attendant had chosen him as her target and would not stop until she had broken him. Around him, passengers whispered, their words blending into a low hum of judgment that stung worse than any shout. Jamal sat upright, clutching his boarding pass tightly against his chest, and tried to steady his breathing. He told himself silently that this would not last forever, that if he endured just a little longer, he would land and stand before an audience who wanted to hear his voice for the right reasons. Yet, in this moment, he was nothing more than a spectacle, a boy being paraded as though he did not belong where he was. He looked out the window, the tarmac lights glowing faintly in the distance, and promised himself he would hold on. Jamal could feel the shame from the last humiliation still clinging to him, the echo of Amanda's sneer, and the whispers from passengers who had watched him bend down to retrieve the boarding pass she had thrown. He kept his eyes locked on the window, willing the runway lights to blur and fade, but Amanda had not yet satisfied her appetite for cruelty. She glided back down the aisle with her tray, deliberately slowing near Jamal's row, and leaned down to whisper in the ear of a white businessman in a crisp suit. The man's eyes flicked quickly toward Jamal as Amanda spoke, her voice low but her words sharp enough to carry to the ears of those sitting closest. "Watch his bag closely," she said, feigning a tone of concern. "I've got a bad feeling about him." The man's brows knitted together, his posture stiffened, and he nodded as if he had just been entrusted with a grave responsibility. That nod was enough to ripple outward, sending suspicion crawling through the row. A woman across the aisle leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of Jamal's backpack beneath the seat. Another man tilted his head toward his companion, whispering something that made both of them frown. Jamal felt it instantly, the shift in atmosphere, the way every eye seemed to weigh more heavily than before. He wanted to protest, to say something, to remind them all that his bag contained nothing more than notebooks, clothes, and the speech he had labored over for weeks, but his throat tightened and silence pinned him down. Amanda straightened and walked away, satisfied that her seed of suspicion had been planted. Jamal sat rigid, his pulse hammering, knowing the lie would spread faster than any defense he could muster. Moments later, a soft child's voice broke the uneasy hum of the cabin. A girl no older than 7 tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked loudly, "Is that boy dangerous?" The question cut through Jamal like a blade. It wasn't the child's fault. Children repeated what they absorbed, and Amanda had orchestrated every step of this poisonous narrative. Still, hearing the words spoken aloud shattered him in ways Amanda's mocking tone could not. He bowed his head, his vision blurring as he stared down at the tips of his shoes. The mother hushed her child quickly, embarrassment coloring her face, but she didn't contradict the assumption. She didn't say, "No, he's just another passenger like us." She only offered the kind of silence that condoned suspicion. Around them, passengers shifted uneasily, some pulling bags closer to their feet, others glancing at the flight attendant for reassurance. Amanda, from further down the aisle, caught Jamal's eye and offered the faintest smirk, a silent acknowledgement that she had orchestrated every ounce of this tension. Jamal clenched his fists tightly, pressing them into his thighs until his nails dug crescents into his skin. He told himself to breathe, to hold on, to remember why he was on this plane in the first place. He thought of the conference hall waiting for him, the rows of young people who would listen to his words about justice and equality. He thought of the hours he had spent practicing in front of the mirror, learning to steady his tone, to project calm and confidence. And yet here he was, reduced to the trembling boy Amanda wanted the world to see. His chest ached with the weight of it. He could sense passengers whispering again, their voices blending into a low drone of mistrust. Every cough, every shuffle of feet felt like a judgment aimed at him. He sat perfectly still, afraid that any sudden movement would confirm the fears Amanda had manufactured. He felt trapped, not only in the narrow seat but in the roles people forced upon him. Amanda had painted him as suspicious, dangerous, less than human, and the passengers, whether out of fear or indifference, had accepted the painting without question. The plane had not even left the runway, and already Jamal was battling a storm heavier than turbulence. A storm made of perception, prejudice, and the unchecked cruelty of a woman who wore authority like a weapon. He thought of his grandmother again, the softness of her hand resting over his, reminding him that dignity could not be stolen unless he allowed it. He whispered to himself, barely moving his lips, "Keep your head up." Jamal sat stiff in his seat, the echoes of whispered suspicion still circling around him like gnats he could not swat away, when the pressure in his chest made it impossible to sit still any longer. He rose carefully, glancing at the passengers beside him, and excused himself in the quietest voice he could manage, clutching his small backpack close as though it could shield him from the stairs. He only wanted a moment to breathe, to splash cold water on his face, to gather himself before the plane lifted into the air. He stepped down the aisle toward the restroom at the back, but Amanda was already there, her hand snapping the latch shut with a loud metallic click just as he reached out for the handle. She turned, her smirk sharp, and leaned against the door as if guarding a vault. "Only the captain can decide when it's safe for you to use this," she said, her words slow and mocking, loud enough for passengers to hear. A man in the aisle seat nearby chuckled nervously, while a woman pulled her child closer against her side. Jamal froze, humiliation burning through him, and mumbled that he only needed a moment, but Amanda tilted her head, pretending to consider his request, before shaking her head in exaggerated disapproval. "Not now," she declared, her voice carrying over the steady hum of the engines. "You'll have to wait." She left the door locked as she walked past him, her perfume trailing in the air, her authority stamped over him with invisible ink. Jamal turned back toward his row, every step heavier than the last, feeling the passenger's eyes boring into his back. As he sat down again, Amanda reached for the intercom with a flourish, her finger pressing the button as if she were delivering news of grave importance. Her voice crackled through the speakers, sharp and commanding. "Some passengers are refusing to cooperate," she announced, her eyes flicking directly toward Jamal as though to frame him before the jury of the cabin. The effect was immediate. Heads turned, necks craned, eyes fixed squarely on Jamal. He felt the weight of dozens of gazes pressing down, some suspicious, some fearful, none of them kind. His heart pounded, his hands gripping the armrest as though they might keep him tethered to sanity. The words Amanda had spoken were vague, but their power was precise. She had planted him as the source of disruption without needing to name him. Every passenger connected the dots she had drawn in the air. A man shifted his suitcase farther beneath his seat. A woman crossed her arms tightly, and another whispered to his companion with a shake of his head. Jamal sat motionless, his throat dry, fighting back the urge to cry out in protest. To speak now would be to confirm what Amanda had already suggested, that he was the problem, that he was the dangerous one. He swallowed the lump in his throat and stared out the window again, the runway lights blurring as his eyes filled with unshed tears. Amanda returned to her duties with an air of self-satisfaction, her posture proud, her chin lifted. She moved gracefully down the aisle, handing drinks and snacks to other passengers as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just marked a boy for judgment before an entire cabin. The injustice of it seared Jamal's chest, but he remembered his grandmother's advice echoing once more, "Keep your head up, Jamal. Do not let them twist your anger into guilt." He clenched his fist in his lap, repeating those words silently, willing himself to endure. Jamal sat in his seat frozen, his hands trembling slightly against the armrest, his eyes fixed on the window, but seeing nothing except his own reflection staring back at him. A reflection of a boy who wanted nothing more than to make it through this flight without further humiliation. Yet Amanda Collins seemed determined to break him. The announcement she had made over the intercom still reverberated in his ears, painting him as uncooperative in the eyes of everyone on board, and the restless shifting of passengers around him confirmed that her words had already taken root. He breathed shallowly, reminding himself that he needed to hold steady, but Amanda's footsteps came clicking back down the aisle like the drumbeat of inevitability. She paused at his row again, her hands clasped tightly behind her back in a posture of authority, and bent down just enough for her shadow to fall across his face. "When we land," she whispered harshly, though loud enough for others nearby to hear, "you'll be escorted by airport security. Just wait." The blood drained from Jamal's face as the words sank in. His stomach twisted violently, and though he wanted to protest, to demand why she was threatening him when he had done nothing wrong, the weight of her authority suffocated him. She had uniform, badge, microphone, and the entire structure of the airline on her side. He was just a boy black, nervous, and already marked in the eyes of the passengers. He felt a lump rise in his throat and fought desperately to keep it down, refusing to give her the tears she wanted. The passengers sitting nearby stiffened visibly at Amanda's statement. A woman clutched her purse tighter against her body. A man 2 rows up tilted his head to glance back, his eyes filled with suspicion, as if confirming for himself that the boy behind him really was trouble. Jamal could feel the net closing in, woven by Amanda's lies, each word a thread binding him tighter into a trap of perception. But before the silence could harden into complete acceptance, a voice spoke up, soft yet firm, cutting through the tense air. "Leave the kid alone," said Robert Miller, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, seated across the aisle. He leaned forward slightly, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "He hasn't done a thing to you. We've all seen it. Enough is enough." For a moment, Jamal felt a flicker of relief, the faint warmth of someone willing to see him as human, not as a caricature of suspicion. His eyes darted toward Robert, silently grateful for the courage it took to speak. But Amanda's reaction was immediate and merciless. She snapped her head toward Robert, her expression darkening with the ferocity of someone unused to being challenged. "Do you want me to write you up too?" she barked, her voice sharp and venomous, designed not only to silence him, but to frighten anyone else who might have thought about standing up. Robert recoiled slightly, his shoulders tightening as though bracing against a blow, but he did not respond further. Around him, passengers shrank deeper into their seats, unwilling to invite Amanda's wrath. The message was clear. To defend Jamal meant to risk becoming a target yourself, and most would rather watch injustice unfold than suffer it firsthand. Jamal's small spark of hope dimmed under the renewed weight of isolation. Even the kindness Robert had shown, fleeting as it was, had been smothered quickly beneath Amanda's authority. He looked down at his lap, his hands tightening into fists, his nails biting into his palms. He thought of his grandmother again, of her words about dignity and strength, and he repeated them in his mind like a shield. "Keep your head up. Don't let them twist you." But the fight inside him grew harder with each passing second. Amanda straightened, satisfied with the silence she had forced, and swept her gaze across the rows of passengers. Her smirk returned, subtle but cruel, as she realized no one else would dare speak against her now. She leaned closer to Jamal once more, her words dripping with condescension. "You see, nobody here will save you," she whispered, her breath hot against his ear. "So sit still and don't cause me any more trouble." Then she walked away, her heels striking the floor like a gavel, sealing his fate. Jamal felt the sting of her words echoing deeper than any before. It wasn't just about his nervous voice anymore, or even the false suspicion she had planted. It was about power, her power to isolate him, to turn him into a villain in front of strangers, to promise a punishment he had done nothing to deserve, and to silence anyone who dared stand with him. The weight of that power pressed against his chest, suffocating and cruel, and yet deep inside him a new feeling began to grow, fragile but persistent. It was anger, yes, but also clarity. He realized he could not remain silent forever, that if he kept shrinking under her accusations, she would strip him of everything before the flight ended. The silence that followed Amanda's threat to hand Jamal over to airport security had settled like a thick fog in the cabin, and the atmosphere felt charged with suspicion and fear. Jamal sat there, staring at the floor, still shaken by her last words. But deep inside, he began to feel something shifting, something breaking through the layers of humiliation and silence. He could hear the whispers, the shuffling of feet, the cautious glances from those who had accepted Amanda's narrative, and he could feel the passengers' judgment pressing down on him, but he knew he could not allow this to continue unchecked. Amanda, emboldened by the silence she had forced onto Robert Miller and the rest of the cabin, decided to push her advantage further. She marched halfway down the aisle, turned dramatically, and raised her voice so that everyone within earshot could hear. "This will be documented," she declared with false authority, her words crisp and sharp. "I will be filing an official incident report about this passenger when we land. Security will be notified before we even touch the ground." The words hit Jamal like another blow, but this time, instead of retreating further into himself, something inside him began to rise. His heart still pounded, but the trembling that had once controlled his voice was giving way to something steadier, something firmer. He could feel his grandmother's words echoing in his chest. "Keep your head up. Do not let them twist your strength into weakness." He lifted his eyes, his jaw tightening, and as Amanda turned to face him with her smug expression, Jamal rose slowly from his seat. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the boy who had seemed so small under Amanda's ridicule now stood tall, his shoulders squared, his eyes steady. He looked around at the passengers, their faces frozen between curiosity and fear, and then he looked directly at Amanda. His voice, though soft, carried with a weight it had not before. "I'm not suspicious," he said, each word deliberate. "I am here as the keynote speaker at the National Youth Justice Conference." For a moment the cabin was silent, stunned by the revelation. Amanda blinked rapidly, her smirk faltering, the confidence in her posture slipping ever so slightly. A murmur spread through the rows, passengers exchanging surprised looks, whispering to one another, trying to reconcile the image Amanda had painted with the words Jamal had just spoken. A boy accused of being dangerous had just revealed himself to be something very different, a voice chosen to speak about justice, fairness, and the very issues Amanda had embodied in her cruelty. Jamal stood there, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, but his voice did not waver again. He repeated it louder this time, so that even the passengers at the front could hear. "I am the keynote speaker at the National Youth Justice Conference. I was invited to speak about fairness, equality, and how young people can change the world." His words hung in the air heavy with truth, and Amanda's eyes darted nervously between him and the passengers now whispering in disbelief. One man muttered, "That can't be right," but a woman beside him said, "I think I've seen his picture before." Jamal reached into his backpack slowly and deliberately, his every move visible to those around him, and pulled out a neatly folded folder. He held it up high so that Amanda and those nearby could see the official seal stamped on the letter inside. "This," he said firmly, "is my invitation from the governor's office. I was asked to speak because I earned a statewide scholarship for leadership in civil rights studies." The cabin buzzed with shock, the passengers no longer looking at him with suspicion but with curiosity, and some with guilt. Amanda opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. For the first time since the flight began, she looked unsettled, her authority shaken. Jamal took a deep breath, his chest rising with the power of his own voice, and sat back down in his seat, still holding the folder on his lap. The murmurs around him grew louder, some passengers nodding to one another, others glancing toward Amanda with questioning eyes. The balance had shifted. Amanda had used her authority to paint him as a danger, but now Jamal had begun to reclaim the truth. He could feel it. This was not the end, but it was the beginning of something different. The cabin was alive with murmurs after Jamal declared his role as keynote speaker, his voice steady and clear, his presence finally larger than the seat he had been forced to shrink into. Amanda stood frozen in the aisle, her lips parted as though she had words ready to hurl, yet nothing came. The passengers who had minutes earlier looked at Jamal with suspicion now shifted uneasily, their expressions softening, some tinged with guilt, others with curiosity. Jamal's hand rested on the folder in his lap, the official seal catching the dim overhead light, a silent but powerful reminder that his words were more than mere claims. As the tension thickened, a voice pierced the air, sharp with recognition. "I know him," said Clara Jennings, a woman seated 3 rows ahead. Her eyes widened as she turned to face the others. "I recognize him. He was featured on the news for winning a statewide scholarship in civil rights studies. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks, whispering to one another, piecing together memories of news, articles, photographs, and television broadcasts they had half forgotten. A teenager once mocked for his shaky voice was now revealed to be a figure of honor, celebrated for his achievements. Jamal's chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, his eyes locking on Clara with silent gratitude. Her words had confirmed what he had begun to say, and now the truth was no longer just his to defend, it belonged to the witnesses in this cabin as well. Amanda's face paled, her smirk evaporating as her authority slipped through her fingers like sand. She shook her head quickly, as though trying to reassert control. But Jamal knew the moment had come. He lifted the folder higher, carefully opening it to reveal the invitation letter, the governor's signature bold and unmistakable at the bottom of the page. He stood again, holding the paper so that those closest could see, and announced with unwavering clarity, "This is my official invitation. I am here because my voice was chosen to represent youth, justice, and equality. The governor himself asked me to speak." The document glowed in the passenger's eyes as proof, undeniable and unshakable. The shift in the cabin was immediate. Where suspicion had once lived, recognition now bloomed. A man muttered, "I remember now, I read about him in the paper." A young college student leaned across the aisle, whispering excitedly, "That's the guy who started that youth program." A hum of realization swelled, voices overlapping, not of fear this time, but of acknowledgement. Amanda stammered, This doesn't change the fact that..." But her words faltered, the confidence stripped from her tone. Her authority, built on lies and intimidation, cracked under the weight of truth. Jamal's hands trembled slightly as he held the letter, but not from fear this time. It was the trembling of release, the surge of standing tall after being forced down for so long. He looked at Amanda, his voice steady as he said, "You tried to paint me as something I'm not, but you can't erase the truth. I belong here. I earned this." His words echoed across the cabin, and the passengers who had once sat in silence now shifted visibly against Amanda's cruelty. Clara Jennings spoke again, louder this time, her voice filled with conviction. "He's telling the truth. I saw the interview myself. He deserves respect, not harassment." The energy of the cabin flipped, the scales tipping against Amanda. The whispers that once condemned Jamal now condemned her. A mother who had pulled her child close earlier now frowned at Amanda, shaking her head in disapproval. The businessman Amanda had poisoned with suspicion earlier leaned back, his expression conflicted, realizing he had been manipulated into judgment. Amanda tried to smile, tried to laugh it off as a misunderstanding, but her mask was cracking. "I was only trying to keep everyone safe," she muttered weakly, her eyes darting around the cabin. But the passengers were no longer convinced. They had seen her cruelty, heard her lies, and now they were faced with undeniable evidence that the boy she had targeted was not a threat but a guest of honor. Jamal sat back down, carefully placing the invitation on his lap, his heart pounding not with fear but with the aftershocks of courage. The weight of Jamal's revelation still hung thick in the cabin. His folder and the governor's letter undeniable proof that he was not only innocent of Amanda's accusations, but also a young man of honor whose voice had been chosen to speak for justice. Clara Jennings' recognition and the murmurs of passengers affirming his identity had already weakened Amanda's grip on authority. Yet she still stood in the aisle with defiance in her posture, as though one more performance of power might return the silence she once commanded. But the silence broke in a way no one expected when the cockpit door opened and Captain Michael Reynolds stepped out. His tall frame filling the narrow passage, his face calm but stern, the gravity of command radiating from his presence. The hum of the cabin stilled at once, every whisper cut short as passengers straightened in their seats, their eyes drawn to the captain whose authority carried more weight than any attendant's. His voice, steady and measured, rolled through the cabin. "Who is disrupting the safety of my flight?" he asked, his gaze sweeping across the rows with practiced precision, landing finally on Amanda. For a fraction of a second, Amanda faltered, her shoulders twitching as though she had been caught in the very act she had hoped to conceal. But then she drew in a sharp breath, straightened her spine, and launched into her defense. "It's him, Captain," she said, pointing at Jamal, her words dripping with false concern. "This passenger has been uncooperative since boarding. He made me feel unsafe, and I have reason to believe he's..." She didn't get to finish. A chorus of voices rose up at once, passengers who had been silent for too long, their patience broken by her lies. "It's her!" shouted a man from the middle rows. "She's the bully!" echoed Clara Jennings, her voice carrying above the din. "We've all seen it!" cried Robert Miller, seizing his chance to speak again, no longer cowed by Amanda's earlier threats. One by one, passengers added their voices, their indignation rising like a tide. She targeted him for no reason. She mocked him. She lied about him. The energy in the cabin shifted completely. The isolation that had once suffocated Jamal now crumbling as truth and solidarity filled the space. Amanda's eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing as though she could still salvage control, but the chorus of accusations against her drowned out any attempt she might make. Captain Reynolds raised his hand, the cabin falling silent under his command, and turned his gaze from Amanda to Jamal. His eyes lingered on the boy clutching the governor's letter, the boy who had stood against humiliation and revealed himself with dignity. He looked back at Amanda, his expression unreadable but his tone sharp. "Step forward," he said, his command directed at her. Amanda froze, her face paling, her authority disintegrating as the reality of her situation sank in. She stammered, "Captain, with all due respect, this boy," but again the passengers interrupted. "Stop lying," shouted a woman in the back. "We heard everything." "You humiliated him," another man added. The voices carried weight now, no longer whispers of fear but declarations of truth, and Amanda's attempts to redirect blame collapsed under the sheer force of collective witness. Jamal sat quietly, his hands still trembling but his heart steady, his eyes fixed on the captain who now held the decision that would define the rest of the flight. For the first time since boarding, he felt the crushing loneliness lift, replaced by a current of strength that surged from the passengers' support. Amanda's cruelty had sparked suspicion, but Jamal's truth had ignited courage, and now the cabin stood not against him but with him. Captain Reynolds studied Amanda for a long moment, his silence louder than any accusation. The weight of command pressed through his measured breathing, his jaw tightening as though restraining the anger rising inside him. Then, with deliberate calm, he spoke again. "We will address this immediately," he said. "But first I need to make it clear. Safety on this flight is not threatened by passengers who tell the truth. It is threatened by those who abuse authority." His words, though not shouted, struck with the force of judgment, and Amanda's shoulders sagged, as though the ground beneath her had given way. The passengers murmured in agreement, their eyes fixed on her with disapproval, some shaking their heads, others crossing their arms in visible contempt. Jamal inhaled deeply, the first breath in hours that did not feel choked by fear, though the pounding of his heart reminded him how fragile the moment was. He glanced around and saw nods of reassurance, fleeting smiles, subtle acknowledgments that he was no longer alone in his fight. Amanda opened her mouth once more, desperation seeping into her tone. "Captain, please, you don't understand." But the captain raised his hand again, silencing her with authority. "That's enough, Amanda," he said, his voice clipped. "The passengers have spoken. I've heard enough." The cabin erupted in quiet applause, restrained at first, then building as passengers allowed themselves to release the tension that had knotted in their chests. For Jamal, each clap was a beat of justice, a rhythm that restored a piece of the dignity Amanda had tried to strip from him. Amanda stood frozen, her face flushed with humiliation, her eyes darting around the cabin for any sign of support, but finding none. The truth had broken through, and with it, her power had crumbled. Jamal sat back in his seat, his body weary but his spirit lifted. The cabin remained hushed under the captain's authority, the echo of passengers' voices still lingering in the air as Amanda stood trapped in the judgment she could no longer escape. Jamal sat with his folder on his lap, his chest heaving with slow, steady breaths, watching the face of Captain Michael Reynolds as the man weighed the moment with the deliberation of someone who knew his decision would ripple beyond this flight. The passengers looked on with anticipation, their expressions taut with expectation, and Amanda shifted her weight nervously from one foot to the other, her once unshakable posture now wilted under the scrutiny of those she had tried to dominate. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his boots firm against the floor, his gaze locked on Amanda. "You are relieved of duty for this flight," he said with measured authority, his words slicing through the tension with the finality of a gavel striking wood. "Gather your things and step off." Gasps rippled through the cabin, the passengers wide-eyed as the declaration sank in. Amanda's face contorted in disbelief, her mouth opening to protest, but no words formed that could save her. Her lips quivered with a desperate need to reclaim power, yet her authority had already evaporated in the air, replaced with shame that clung to her uniform like a stain. "Captain, please," she stammered, her voice shrill. "This is a misunderstanding. I was protecting." But her words faltered as the passengers shook their heads, their expressions hardened against her lies. Claire Jennings folded her arms tightly and called out, "We all saw what happened. Don't pretend." Robert Miller added firmly, "You bullied him. You tried to make us afraid of him. We won't forget it." The murmurs of agreement swelled until Amanda's protests were drowned beneath the chorus of truth. The captain raised a hand for silence, then gestured toward the exit. "This is not a debate. You abused your authority and disrupted the safety of this flight. You will step off now." His voice was calm, resolute, unshakable. Amanda's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her as reality pressed down. She bent to gather her things, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her service bag. The aisle cleared as passengers shifted back, their eyes fixed on her, their silence louder than any words of condemnation. Jamal watched, his heart conflicted. A part of him felt vindicated, the heavy weight of injustice finally lifting. Yet another part of him saw the collapse of a woman who had wielded power carelessly and now faced the consequences. Amanda shuffled forward, her face pale, her eyes darting to the passengers for any flicker of sympathy. But none came. They sat firm, their gazes hard, their collective memory unwilling to forgive the spectacle of cruelty she had inflicted. As she passed Jamal's row, her eyes flicked toward him briefly, not with apology but with bitterness, a silent acknowledgement that he had stood against her and won. Jamal met her stare evenly, his expression calm, no triumph in his features, only dignity. The captain signaled for another attendant to escort her out, and Amanda disappeared down the aisle, her presence swallowed by the narrow exit at the front of the plane. For a heartbeat, the cabin remained in stunned silence, the reality of what they had just witnessed settling over them. Then, slowly, a wave of clapping began, tentative at first, then swelling into a thunderous rhythm that filled the cabin with relief and approval. The applause was not just for Amanda's removal but for the restoration of justice, for the boy who had endured humiliation with grace and courage. Jamal sat still, humbled by the sound, his chest swelling not with pride but with gratitude. Across the aisle, Robert Miller lifted his phone high, the screen glowing as he streamed the event live. "People need to see this," he muttered, his voice tinged with conviction. Within minutes, notifications began to ping, messages buzzing across his screen as viewers tuned in, the incident spreading beyond the confines of the cabin. The passengers leaned toward the phone, watching as comments poured in, outrage sparking against the airline for allowing such cruelty, admiration flooding in for the boy who had revealed the truth with dignity. Claire Jennings leaned over, whispering, "The world is going to know what happened here." Jamal blinked, the realization settling in that his humiliation had become not only a personal ordeal, but a public lesson. The camera caught his face, calm and resolute, the folder still resting in his lap, the governor's letter peeking out like a symbol of the truth that had defended him. As the live feed grew, strangers across the internet reacted with fury at Amanda's actions, demanding accountability, calling for change. The passengers watched in awe as a story that had begun with whispers of suspicion now exploded into a broadcast of justice. Amanda's cruelty had gone viral, but so had Jamal's courage. The captain returned to the cockpit after ensuring order, his voice carrying over the intercom with steady reassurance. "We will continue this flight without further disruption. Thank you for your patience." His words were met with murmurs of approval, but the true focus remained on Jamal, whose quiet strength had turned the tide. Jamal leaned back in his seat, exhaustion washing over him, his fingers brushing against the letter once more. He had not sought fame or attention, only the chance to speak his truth, yet fate had placed him in the center of a moment larger than himself. The humiliation had been painful, the isolation suffocating, but now justice had been served in a way that would resonate far beyond this plane. The cabin had finally quieted after Amanda was escorted off the plane, but the echoes of what had happened still lingered. The passengers glancing at one another with the unspoken bond of shared witness to injustice and the relief of seeing it corrected. Jamal sat in his seat with the governor's letter on his lap, the folder, a symbol of truth that had turned the tide when words alone were not enough. His body was weary, his mind heavy from the storm he had endured, but his spirit felt lighter than it had since the moment Amanda had first mocked him. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the hum of the engines and the faint sounds of conversation around him. For the first time since boarding, those conversations were no longer whispers about him but reflections on what they had just seen. Voices of acknowledgement that the cruelty he had suffered was wrong. Then a new voice came, softer yet filled with intent. As a younger flight attendant approached his row, her eyes kind, her posture different from Amanda's sharp dominance, she bent slightly and spoke with genuine respect. "On behalf of the airline, I want to apologize for what happened to you today. We are ashamed of how you were treated. The captain has instructed me to offer you a seat in first class for the remainder of the flight. You deserve comfort after what you endured." She gestured toward the front, where the plush seats of first class awaited, a symbolic gesture of atonement. Jamal looked at her, his eyes calm but steady, then glanced down at the letter in his lap, the governor's signature glinting under the dim light. Slowly, he shook his head, his voice quiet but firm when he spoke. "I don't want special treatment. I want fair treatment for everyone." The attendant's eyes widened slightly, taken aback by his refusal, but then she nodded, a flicker of admiration in her gaze. She straightened and stepped back, leaving Jamal to sit where he was, his choice not one of pride but of principle. The passengers nearby heard his words and nodded, their respect for him deepening with the realization that he had not only defended his dignity, but was now choosing to model what justice truly meant. After a few moments, Jamal rose from his seat again, feeling the eyes of the cabin settle on him once more. But this time, those eyes were not filled with suspicion or fear. They were filled with expectation, with curiosity, with the openness of people who had been forced to confront their own silence. He stood tall, the folder still in his hand, and let his voice carry across the rows. "Justice isn't about revenge," he said, his tone even and measured. "It's about respect. Today I was mocked, humiliated, and treated as less than human because of my voice, because of the color of my skin. That should never happen to anyone. And it should not take proof from a governor's letter or recognition on the news for me to be seen as worthy of dignity. Every person on this plane, every person in this world deserves respect, no matter how they speak, no matter how they look." The cabin was silent, the words sinking into every passenger like stones cast into still water, rippling outward with meaning. Jamal paused, letting the weight of silence underscore his message, then continued. "I don't hate Amanda. I don't want her destroyed. What I want is for her and for all of us to learn that power is not a weapon to humiliate others. Power should be used to protect, to uplift, to guide. What happened today should never happen again. Not on this plane, not anywhere." His words were not angry but resolute, not bitter but purposeful, and the passengers listened with rapt attention, their own faces softening as they recognized the truth in his voice. A woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A man clasped his hands tightly in his lap as though in prayer, and even children sat still, sensing the importance of what was being spoken. Jamal lowered the folder to his side and ended with a quiet strength that carried more power than any shout. "Respect is not a privilege to be earned. It is a right we all deserve." For a moment, the silence was absolute, heavy, and profound, as if the entire cabin had been suspended in time by the weight of his words. Then the applause began, slow and reverent, building into a steady rhythm that filled the air. A sound not of casual approval, but of deep gratitude, of recognition that they had been given more than a moment of justice. They had been given a lesson in humanity. Tears glistened in the eyes of passengers, some clapping with hands trembling, others rising to their feet in acknowledgement of the boy who had endured humiliation and turned it into a message that would outlive the flight itself. Jamal sat back down slowly, his heart pounding, not from fear but from the release of carrying something heavy and finally setting it free. He looked out the window at the endless stretch of sky, a smile flickering across his face as he thought of his grandmother. He whispered softly, so only he could hear, "I kept my head up." The engines roared as the plane cut through the night, but inside the cabin there was a quiet transformation, a collective awakening that would follow each passenger long after they stepped off. What had begun with humiliation had ended with dignity. What had begun with cruelty had ended with truth. And what had begun with silence had ended with voices raised together in respect. The end If this story moved you, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to know what you think about the plot, what part stood out to you the most, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel.